Hello, everyone, and welcome to FOREPI Council's webinar on the value of connectivity in automotive. My name is Claudia Tapia, and I am a president of FOREPI Council. As you may already know, FOREPI Council is a not-for-profit research council developing high-quality academic insight and empirical evidence on topics related to intellectual property and innovation. Next. On FOREPI Council website, we offer an extensive body of research addressing current intellectual property and innovation topics. You will find also the report of today's presenter on the value of connectivity in the automotive sector, as well as a recent Q&A feature we conducted with him on the broader topic of economic value. A popular resource we offer is a library of case summaries covering national court decisions following the Court of Justice of the EU ruling on Huawei versus CTE. Please click Stay Informed on the right-hand side of our homepage to be informed of new cases, research, and future webinars. Next. We are also committed to encouraging innovative SMEs to use IP to grow the businesses, and we provide a range of resources to help them achieve this end. We will upload the recording of this webinar and the slides free of charge following the presentation. Please use the Q&A tool that you can see at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I will read them after that, after the presentation. Next. And now, please allow me to introduce you to our great speaker, Dr. Bowman Heiden. Amongst many responsibilities, Dr. Bowman Heiden is currently the co-director of the Center for Intellectual Property, which is a joint center for knowledge-based business development between industry and a number of Nordic university partners. He's also a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and a member of the European Commission high-level expert group on standard essential patents. Without further delay, Bo, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks a lot, Claudia. I'm in Sweden now. I'm back in Sweden. I'm up in the north of Sweden for this webinar. It's sunny out, too bad I can't show you. In Sweden, we're so far up north in Sweden now that we don't have a 2-meter rule. We have a 2-kilometer rule between people, so we're kind of keeping our safe distance. It's funny when I see you put the picture of me up on the screen, I look over because I'm sitting in my kitchen and my wife has a picture of me when we got married up on the refrigerator. It's supposed to stop me from opening up the refrigerator door, remembering how thin I used to be. It's not working as intended, though, but it reminds me of that. All right, so let's get on a little bit to today's presentation. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll open up for questions. I look forward to your questions. So I'll go through the material quite quickly. Half of it is in my report and then we'll talk a little bit more about a related issue afterwards. I think we can start by saying that the debate as to whether all vehicles will be connected is over. I think it's fair to say. The remaining questions are how will they be connected, for what purpose, and who will capture the value that flows through the automotive ecosystem. And that's what we'll talk about today. So the first part of the presentation will be about value and how much value is being created. It's good to start there. How much value is being created and by who? And then, of course, we'll venture into more treacherous waters of distribution of value. So how is value distributed? We'll put some perspective on that. And maybe we'll talk about how it should be. We'll be a little normative maybe, but that, of course, will make things a little bit more edgy for people, I'm sure. So the first thing to start out with, of course, is that connectivity is considered to be one of the main megatrends. And so if you want to ask, is connectivity really important? And that's why I think the debate is over. You don't have to ask the telecommunications people. You just have to ask the automotive people. So I read through every annual report, and every automotive company talks about connectivity as being one of the main key areas for the development of their industry, especially as the industry is evolving to something more aligned with mobility than by the production, just the production of vehicles. So connectivity is an area by itself, but also connectivity is related to autonomous driving. It's also related to shared mobility. And the quotes that I have up there are just a few of the quotes that you can find in almost any annual report by any automaker. For example, if you go to the Toyota annual report, the first 4 pages are completely dedicated to connectivity. So again, I would suggest that the question is over whether there's value, it's just how much and how it should be distributed. Next, please. So if we look at the vehicle ecosystem, we see that right now, if we talk about the value of connectivity, it's starting from, obviously from a smaller size and then growing. As we see this, the car talking to the cloud, vehicle to the network. It can be done either through the car or through a mobile phone now. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but presently, primarily the connectivity in vehicles is a complementary value-added service, but growing in that regard. However, in the future, it's important to know that through V to X and as we move to more autonomous driving, the connectivity will become a core feature in what a vehicle actually is. So when a car becomes more about mobility and the ability to interface with infrastructure and other vehicles and pedestrians, as well as to the net, then it won't be about just a complementary value-added feature. It'll be a core part of what makes a car, or what makes mobility, mobility. Next. And in this regard, there's a number of complementary and competing technology standards for connectivity. So we of course have GPS through satellite. And when it comes to V to N, we have cellular communication, and then through your phone, of course, cellular communication. And these are complementary, Bluetooth as well. So when we tether a device to our car, that's usually through Bluetooth now, not through a wire, as you know. But there's also competing standards between cellular and Wi-Fi. And the good thing about competition is that depending on which connectivity standard is chosen, it tells us something about how the market values different technology. And that's important. If one connectivity solution is chosen over another, then the market is giving us signals about what is more valuable and how this should be priced in. And that's what we'll talk more about in the future. Next, please. So if we start with looking into the automotive connectivity space and just focus on the automotive ecosystem, using information that I received from Statista, which I think is relatively conservative. So it's focused mostly on the value of the hardware that's embedded in the automobile and then the services that are sold on top, but mostly within the vehicle ecosystem. So not necessarily the ecosystem that includes all the services that are done through the mobile phone, but only through the vehicle ecosystem itself. We can see that what I would call the embedded connectivity in car revenue is 6.4 billion in 2018 and 18.7 billion worldwide. There was 10 million connected cars that are sold in 2018, but there's 39 million already on the road. And it's important to separate this because the value of connectivity relates to the hardware and physical systems that are sold in each car, but then the value created by services depends on the number of connected cars that are on the road that are generating service. So a car will have value in relation to what is sold, what is the value of connectivity at point of sale, but value will also be generated year after year for the lifetime of the car. So when this is calculated, just based on these relatively conservative numbers from just within the embedded car vehicle connectivity ecosystem, the amount is $670 US per connected car in the United States and 593 per connected car worldwide. And this again, starting from today's more modest beginnings, which is forecasted to grow in the field of services. But then, of course, as the car becomes more connected as part of its functionality, the value will go up in other different ways, which we'll talk about next. Next, please. So if we move into the future, the implementation of V to X is of course going to create a completely different value proposition, where I would say the vehicle as a connectivity enabled value proposition. It won't be seen as something separate, it'll be something core. The same will be when we move to more automation in autonomous vehicles. Connectivity will be critical for that. What we'll also see is an increase in positive externalities. So even though we'll see more value being created directly in the market for connectivity within automobiles, we'll also see a lot of value to society. The same, as you can see here, this is from a study by Bosch. They'll be saving 11,000 lives, reducing leading to fewer than 260,000 fewer accidents. We'll be able to avoid 400,000 tons of CO2 emissions. We'll save 280 million driving hours. So as a car starts to evolve, becomes more connected, becomes more autonomous, the value that's delivered not only to the consumer, but also to society will start to grow as well. And this, of course, has to be seen as the total value that comes from connectivity. The number here that was also chosen in, that was produced by Machina Research, the $253 billion in revenue is just the direct revenue that's created. The other statistics here are indirect value that's created. And we'll see more and more of that as the vehicle becomes more connected and there's more functionality developed from that in the future. Next, please. So that leads us to looking at the automotive connectivity stack. So if we start from the bottom in this illustration, we have the core communication technologies and communication infrastructure, and then the operator connectivity access. That tends to be very similar as it is even in the mobile phone ecosystem. But here, if we instead not only talk about mobile phones, but talk about embedded systems into as part of automotive connectivity system, then on top of that, we have the automotive application services that can be accessed either through embedded systems in vehicles or also through mobile phones. But we also have to take into account the consumer surplus. So not only what is the total market revenue that we can see through the market, but how much were customers willing to pay? Because the total value that's created, the total economic value that's created in a model for society is equal to not only what is created in the market, but also what people are willing to pay, which I'll describe in more detail later. We could also create another concept on net social value, which would include the positive and negative externalities. So in order to look at the total value of connectivity, we have to look not only at the direct, but the indirect value. If you see from the stack, the focus is on the value enabled by connectivity, not the vehicle value. So the cost of an actual vehicle is not in here. It's only the cost of the components that go into the vehicle and the applications that allow for connectivity and the value generated by that by consumers. But it is important to understand that there is a competition between the vehicle and smartphone platform. So some value flows through the smartphone, through apps, such as when you use Uber or when you use navigation through your mobile phone. And then there's competition for this by using the connectivity that's embedded in the vehicle ecosystem. Both of these are based on connectivity, but one flows through the vehicle ecosystem and one through the smartphone. And as most of you know, there's a bit of a battle going on, and Apple and Google are already in the car trying to grab a hold of the control of this interface, because the vehicle now is seen as the next big digital platform. Next, please. So if we look at then the connectivity value pools, what are the different places that value is being created in this value stack? We can talk about the hardware and different specific vehicle services and infotainment services. This is taken from the former slide for the model of the embedded value within the vehicle ecosystem. But we can also talk about other types of value pools, such as usage-based insurance. Currently, a number of actors supply a separate connectivity device that captures this information directly for insurance companies, but Certainly in the future, this will be going through the embedded ecosystem in a car. We can talk about smart parking. We can talk about fleet management services, which is more of a B2B activity. And you can see that one of the biggest areas is ride hailing. And so for now, if we want to use Uber, we get on the mobile phone and we call for a car. In the future, if we have autonomous driving, then there won't be a person on the other end. So it'll be a bit of a hybrid between the individual with a mobile phone and the car using its embedded functionality. So some of this value and these value pools flow through the vehicle ecosystem, some through the mobile ecosystem, but they're all related to the overall value created in the automotive connectivity. And in this regard, we have you can see the different. I want to put up the numbers for a few different studies. There were a number of studies on consumer willingness to pay, which is a good indication of consumer welfare and how much consumers demand these types of services. Different studies range from $210 to $1,215. More on these specific studies are in the report. Then we have information on producer willingness to sell. How much are car companies actually offering their connectivity services for customers? And that ranged from $330 to $22,000 over the lifetime of the car. As I showed in the previous slides, looking just at the embedded connectivity market, we saw $670 or $593 worldwide per connected vehicle. And then if we look specifically at one car company in one technology area, so 4G using GM OnStar, you can see based on this information that the value captured over the lifetime of the car was $1,500 approximately in the US and $634 worldwide. So the other numbers there are averages or ranges, whereas the number here from the study of the 4G value created by GM OnStar is specifically for their car. So one thing that we'll note, of course, is that different cars will offer different services, and therefore connectivity, the value will be different based on what they offer. Next, please. All right, so that ends the first part. So I would hope that we could all agree with the first part, which is very much what's written in the report that I have produced, is that there is a lot of value being created. And the question is, how is it being created? What new value streams will be created in the future? And where is this value where is the connectivity that defines this value coming from? We can all tend to agree on those factors. The next question is distribution of value. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a perspective on distribution of value. How much value are we talking about? I'm going to do it in the context of standard essential patents. So when we talk about how much money is being spent on standard essential patents, I want to put it in perspective of the overall market and the total economic value that was created in the first part. And then if we have time, we can talk a little bit about whether this amount of money is actually fair or unfair. I'm sure everyone has opinions on that. So to start off with, it's good to think theoretically that a lot of the discourse over standard essential patents starts from the area of mobile telephony. And it's basically a battle of two market failures. The first first market failure that's been known for a long time is this idea that people will not do a lot of R&D if they know they can't appropriate the value from it. No one's going to spend a lot of money creating something if then someone else can just take it and use it for free. This is known as an appropriation problem, described by Kenneth Arrow, the Nobel laureate, as the information paradox. And of course, one way to solve this problem is through patents. Patents allow actors who create information or knowledge to appropriate the value and to be able to transact upon it. But what's happened in the debate about SEPs is that while actors have used patents to be able to appropriate their investment in R&D, the argument has been is that there's too many patents and that these patents, even though they solve one problem, are causing another problem that's often termed patent holdup, which then, when a lot of different patent holdup issues are stacked on top of each other, you get royalty stacking. So now we have the idea that there was a problem with not enough investment, which we solve through patents, and now there's an argument that there's too much patents, which causes a problem, a market failure on the downstream products and services. So then it becomes an empirical question. So I want to spend a little bit of time looking at this issues empirically. And of course, the first thing that I did when I studied this is I started to say, well, if there really is a market failure downstream, if we really have patent holdup and royalty stacking, what should we see? And of course, in theory, what we should see is markets are failing, prices are very high, people are not entering into the market. But instead, what we see on this picture, you can see is Nepalese farmers have mobile phones. Some of the poorest people in the world have mobile phones. The mobile phone market is growing and thriving. It's probably one of the most successful markets in the world. So it doesn't necessarily bode well for the idea that there's some severe market failure. But let's look at it a bit closer. Let's dig into a little bit more. So next, please. There hasn't been very many studies that have actually dug into and tried to determine what is actually the situation when it comes to royalties on the market. My colleagues at Stanford, Alex Gleptovich and Steve Haber and Lou Zaretsky did a paper and published it in 2018 where they looked at the 2016 smartphone market. And you can see from the diagram that they modeled the demand and the production. And so the total revenues for 2016 were $425 billion. From this, they modeled a consumer surplus, the triangle above the blue line, 784 billion, so a 1.2 billion in total economic value. And they calculated the SEP royalties at 2.4 billion based on numbers that were actually gathered from SEC filings through 10Ks and other financial disclosures. So here we actually for the first time, take a look at exactly what people are receiving and put it together with how much money there is being generated in the mobile phone space. Now, this doesn't include also the apps and all the other downstream over-the-top services that also create value on the mobile phone. This is just from the mobile phone revenue itself, which creates a 2.9% royalty rate from a revenue perspective. And if you look at the total economic value perspective, including the consumer surplus, now we're down to 1%. So certainly from this image, which explains why the other image that the Nepalese farmer has a mobile phone, is that there isn't that much holdup or royalty stacking in the mobile phone market as people think. So while there theoretically could be, empirically there is not. Next, please. So if we now we can take the next step. That was a comparison of SEP royalties in relation to the mobile phone space. But we could take a look at the overall revenues that are created in the total mobile economy. And here I used a study from BCG in 2014. There's a new study that's come out now by GSMA. It puts the total mobile economy at around 4.1 trillion. But if we use the numbers here, the total mobile revenue of 3.3 trillion, a consumer surplus in the 6 countries that they looked at 6.4 trillion. And again, we put the $12.4 billion of SEP royalties in this perspective. We see that it's 0.37% in relation to revenue and 0.13% in relation to total economic value. So the standards that underpin all the value that's being created, both in the mobile market and for customers in regard to their willingness to pay, the consumer value being created is immense compared to the amount of money that's being exchanged for SEP royalties. Next, please. If we now compare this to the automotive industry, if we take the 253 billion in connected vehicle revenue that was cited in the Bosch report, and we add 500 billion, estimated 500 billion of consumer surplus to this, we can do the same calculation just within the area of connected vehicles, where if we take the estimated SEP royalties, and here I took the $15 as an estimate from the Avanci pool, and I multiplied it by all the vehicles that are estimated to be connected, and that'll be produced in the world in 2025. This is an estimation. And again, we do the same graph where we show that this 1.2 billion is only 0.51% of the revenue and 0.17% of the total economic value being created just within the connected vehicle economy. So again, a rather small percentage in relation to the total value being created. Next. So this leads to a few principles of valuation that have been discussed throughout this presentation, but now I'll talk about them a little more in depth. The first is that according to basic economics, price theory defines value as the consumer's willingness to pay. So this is the demand curve in this graph to the right. So the difference between the demand curve, the line, and the consumer and the price defining the producer surplus is the consumer surplus. That is the value that's created by the difference between a consumer's willingness to pay and what they actually have to pay on the market. So what would they pay minus the price that they have to pay? That is still value that's created in the market. And that value is created because of connectivity. So connectivity is an enabling technology that underpins value creation and should be related to the valuation use case. So connectivity underpins the value, but the value that it creates depends on which use it's applied to. So we talked about the different uses within automotive. We talked about how the different cases and use cases for the value of automotive may change between now and the future as it becomes a core part of automotive or mobility functionality. Now, market transactions are the means by which value is revealed. So as much as possible, you want to look and find market transactions. You want to see when people on the market choose one standard over another. You want to look and see how much are companies offering connectivity services for. You want to see how those prices are accepted by consumers. So it's the consumers in the end of the day that are the arbiter of the value of technology or value of any goods and services. And this is not just for SEPs. That's why I put on the top of the slide principles of SEPs in parentheses, because these are basic principles of valuation, no matter what we're talking about. It's important as well, in addition to defining the total economic value, as shown in this illustration, to think about externalities as well, because as we start to move to autonomous driving and connectivity enabled vehicles, we will start to produce, as I showed in the Bosch report, slide about the Bosch report, we're going to save a lot of pollution, we're going to save a lot of lives, we're going to have less accidents. There's going to be a lot of value that's not priced into the market. It's external to the market. And in addition to those value spillovers, the more we see multi-sided platforms on the market, we also need to think when something is provided for free, but money is made through advertising or through use of data on another market, that means that the value of connectivity is captured in a market that's separate from the automotive market or the automotive connectivity market itself, in the same way that the value for when Google search is not captured on the search market, it's captured on the advertisement market. Next, please. So for discussion, as we move forward, the last slide. The good news is that connectivity is creating value for everybody. So that's the good news. And again, I hope we can all agree that connectivity in vehicles is creating and has the potential to create a lot of value. You don't have to believe me. You can just read what the chairman of the board of every automotive company says. Now for automotive companies or for implementers in general in this area, if I put on my strategy hat for a second, the important thing to focus on here is not the 0.5% SEP royalties. The important thing to focus on is the 99.5% of the rest of the value that's being created in the ecosystem, because it's not obvious that that value is going to flow to the automakers. There's big competitors. There's a battle of ecosystems to see who will capture this value. So the focus should be more on the 99.5% than on the 0.5%. When it comes to SEP holders, the advice going forward is to focus on norms and timing. So when it comes to automotive specifically, I know I'm talking with people that were involved in developing the platform Avanci, that many years of discussions with the automotive industry went into trying to determine the right price and to get both patent holders on board with automakers in a way that people would accept the pricing and the terms of the agreement. And I know this takes a lot of effort and a lot of the discussions about the norms and how automotive actors would like to have licenses handled by their tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. And so again, as we move into more IoT solutions, SEP holders are going to have to invest this time to try to understand the specific norms about how these new market actors, these new IoT verticals work, and try to find a way to fit the thinking of SEP licensing into find a compromise between how the telecom norms work and how these industry verticals work. And also when it comes to timing, even though it's not obvious right from the beginning when a standard is created, how this will create value, and we've said that the value should be related to the use case, the closer in time, so the earlier the discussion can start, the closer in time licensings can take place before people have already started to roll out lots of products, would make the situation easier. Although I know that this is a difficult issue as well. Thank you very much. I'm happy to open up for questions.
Thanks, Paul. Very interesting presentation. Thanks for sharing. We have received a couple of questions in the meantime. So let me start with the first one. Will SEP licensing be more or less difficult in IoT applications than in mobile devices?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the questions that we're asking ourselves at the European Commission right now. And I think that the first initial thinking is that, well, we're going to have more standards are becoming more complex. There's more people involved in creating the standards themselves. On top of that, there's going to be all these different verticals. It's not just going to be mobile phones and tablets. It's going to be cars and lawnmowers and scooters and agricultural solutions and machines and you name it, healthcare, that this would actually make things more difficult. It is, however, possible that because the difficulty doesn't rely in the number of patents or the number of applications, it relies in the mechanisms that you put in place to allow these actors to interface well, that possibly more pooling could take place, as we see with Avanci. We could see, as well as with Avanci, to have a set price that stays the same no matter how many more patents are added to the pool. If all the patents are in the pool, then this eliminates the nature of numbers of actors coming and asking for licenses, which is the royalty stacking issue. And so it's possible that because when we move to a new paradigm into IoT, we have the opportunity to set new norms together. So that's one of the reasons why I talk about spending time to get to know each other and understand the norms and understand the problems with timing. You know, one of the issues of timing is that people procure things in a long time frame that could be where contracts could be nailed down that are not within the same time frame of the implementation of different standardized technology. So there is a possibility now to create a new paradigm where it could become easier if both sides are able to come together.
Mm-hmm. Why is, next question, why is SAP licensing challenging to enact across the entire industry, such as automotive?
Yeah, so I think when you move into new areas, it relates a bit to the last question, that everyone has their own norms and everyone is used to doing things in a certain way. So that's one issue. So when you come into a new area, if licensing has been done in the telecom industry in one way and licensing is handled in the automotive industry in another way, can we come up with a new solution, or do we need to compromise into one or another model? How will this be done? That, of course, slows things down. And then, of course, there's always the issue that no one wants to take a license until everybody has taken the license. So you have this collective action problem. So on one hand, if we talk about Avanci, you have most of the SEPs have been gathered in one place, but we don't have all the automakers gathered in one place willing to accept a license at the same time. You know, one of the main reasons that people don't take a license is that they don't want to be on a competitive disadvantage from their competitors who haven't taken a license. So this ability to get everyone to be on board at the same time always creates a difficulty. So who should go first? And this collective action problem always slows things down.
You just mentioned Avanti, and I have here a question asking regarding the figures you showed before. Yeah. Does the SAP cost figure only include the Avanti royalties? Because it seems that 0.51 figure is higher for connected cars than smartphones, which would be 0.37.
So the question is whether one percentage is more than the other.
What the question is whether these SAP cost figures includes Avanti only.
Yeah, so the question, yeah, I only calculated on Avanti only. So the question that you would have to ask is, are there other people outside of the Avanti patent platform who would also ask for royalties for their patents? So that's the question. And it's important to understand there is an issue in relation to standard essential patents in that not everyone who has them seeks royalties. And certainly there can be actors that have standard essential patents in 4G and 5G that also produce products for automotive OEMs and other suppliers that may not necessarily, because of that business, ask for royalties based on their SEPs. So the question is not only whether Avanti has all the SEPs on the platform, but do they have effectively all the SEPs from actors that will actively license? So that would be the question. And I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Also another question is asking regarding the difference in value of, for example, a Mercedes versus a cheaper car. And how would this be considered when you're calculating the value of connectivity? And I had to think about this paper that you probably read of Sunil Arya, right, that was published this year in Grow International, and he looked at these connected cars and what the consumers will be willing to pay for. He estimated this 11 years average time for a car. And you saw figures like a Ford would be like 761 euros, whereas a Porsche would be over 20,000 euros. Of course, this is far from the 15 of Avanti, but still, how can you see this? How can you look at the value considering all this big difference in prices? How is this impacting, if it's impacting the value of connectivity?
Right. So when I did my calculations, I based all my calculations on what was actually sold. So when companies offer something to their customers, that's what they're hoping that they will pay for it. I don't have the numbers to say who actually paid of the Porsche owners, how many paid 22,000, and how many of the Ford paid, was it 700 or the other amount? So I used the numbers in total. I didn't have it broken down like that. I think that Sunil's study is really good in showing that it gives you an indication. That's why I separated it from my figure of 670 per connected car in the US and 593 worldwide. I separated it as a separated as a specific item to think about on its own in relation to that, because it gives you an indication of what companies think people are willing to pay, but it's more like willingness to sell. Now, it also shows you that different companies offer at completely different rates, and they of course differentiate their pricing based on their brands and what they think that their customers are willing to pay. It's not sure that they offer that many better features across the different areas, but I know that Sunil's paper digs in. So if anyone wants to read that paper, you can look and see exactly how much is the value based on what is offered by the company and how much is related to maybe the brand and the type of car that people are driving. But for my calculations, I haven't included that at all. I've only looked at actual value for services bought.
Mm-hmm. We have a message from Eric Stasik here in Stockholm. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Eric.
So he says, you talk about consumer value as principle of SEP evaluation, but the competition law argument around SEP licensing is that holds up occurs when the SEP holder extracts rents far above a competitive price, the competitive price being the ex-ante value of the patented technology compared to a non-infringing alternative, at least according to some jurisdictions. So how do you square consumer value argument to the competition law argument? Can consumers be held up but still be satisfied with the value they enjoy?
Yes, the way I've never really completely understood when people say that the value for SEPs needs to be determined based on their value, but not the added value of the standard. I've never completely understood that. And when you look at the court cases around the world and how this has been applied, it's obvious that no one really understands what that means. One way to look at it is to say that, as I think Eric is asking, this ex ante, this bottom up, I think it's called valuation thinking, where you're supposed to compare the value that could have been put into the standard, but wasn't. So first of all, you have this hypothetical market that didn't really exist that you have to fabricate. The problem that I have, and I think the easiest way to discuss this, is if the SEP owners, the people that develop the standards, don't share in the value of the standard, then who does? It doesn't go away. The value has to go either to some producer or the consumer. So if the value, when someone says that you shouldn't get, that the SEP owners shouldn't get the value of the standards, they're basically arguing that they should get the value of the standards instead, because the value has to go somewhere. And so why shouldn't it go, at least in part, to the people who created the standard? So I think it's better to look at what is the total value that's being created, and then how should it be distributed, instead of saying just one group shouldn't benefit from that total value. That seems logical to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have another question which says, will you agree that the vanity rate of $15 per vehicle is rather too low in view of the huge portfolio license, about 75% of all LTE SEPs?
Yeah, so now there's, when I first started to research on this issue over 10 years ago, the big issue was patent holdup, and everyone was saying, no, there isn't patent holdup. And there's been a big defense about that. But one of my last papers I wrote was, well, is there actually, not only is there maybe not patent holdup, maybe there's patent holdout. So maybe that's the new discussion that should be asked, that maybe $15 in relation to the total value being created is too low. And of course, instead of trying to say whether that is true or even trying to figure out whether that's true or not, it would be best, of course, that the market decides. And certainly some people have decided that the amount is okay and is accepted to be part of the avancée, and some haven't. And they may not have anything to do. A lot of the discussions I have with automakers is it's not necessarily to do with the amount, but more about the level of licensing and how that will be handled. But there's an argument to be made that it is too low for gathering all the SEPs in one place. I mean, I can pay more than $15 an hour in San Francisco to park my car. The $15 for all the SEPs that cover the connectivity that underpin the connected vehicle for the lifetime of the vehicle doesn't sound like too much.
Right, you are talking now about the license level, and it matches very well with one of the questions we received. It says, considering the massive value that automotive industry is obtaining out of standardized connectivity, who in the value chain should take a license?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, Claudia, I missed part of that.
Yeah, the question is basically who in the value chain should take a license?
Right. So, I mean, one of the ideas, and I'm finishing a paper now about this. To me, I'd see that SEP value and licensing level are interrelated with each other. I think you can't separate them. For me, the reason that people argue for the level of licensing to be moved upstream in the value chain is to reduce the royalty base and therefore reduce the value of SEPs. So if you argue that it should be on the component level, you're not just arguing that that would be the most efficient place to do the licensing, you're arguing that the base should be the component and therefore the total value should be much less. So my argument is that, well, let's go back to price theory. And in price theory, let's say that the value should be created based on the consumer's willingness to pay. Let's come up with a value contribution of connectivity to the use case. And then once we have the value based on the consumer value, then we can place it anywhere in the value chain that's most efficient. And for most cases, it will probably still be in the downstream for many reasons related to how the supply chain works, related to exhaustion, related to a number of issues. It will likely still be more efficient from a transaction cost and from a market norm perspective to be closer to the consumer. But let's first decouple the value from the place in the value chain, because otherwise we're really having a negotiation on price disguised as a level of licensing discussion.
Another question, is litigation a sign that markets do not function properly?
I think that when we try to make problems out of the situation with SCPs and the challenges related to SCP licensing, this idea that people say, well, look, there's litigation. The market's not working. It's not the sign that when people go and litigate is part of a normal functioning market. This is not a sign that things are going wrong. There's almost always litigation in new areas because there's new norms being created and people aren't sure. Some people work things out, but some people don't agree. And then you have to go to court, and the court hopefully over time will come to a consensus, which then the market actors will understand and say, well, we kind of know what will happen if we go to court, so we don't need to go to court. As long as the different courts in the world give different responses, which some could argue that they do in the SCP field, then the market actors will not come to a better consensus and understanding what would happen if they went to court, which means that you'll create more court cases, but it doesn't mean that there's a market failure. I remember that there's always this picture that was always shown to me in the beginning. I think they're online, of all these lines with all this smartphone wars and all the cases that were going on. And it made it look as if there should never be a smartphone, should never be produced. I mean, if someone were to show you that picture, you would think, well, he must not be able to produce a smartphone. There's 250,000 patents, people say, in a smartphone, and nobody agrees with anybody else. How could we possibly create a smartphone? Yet we do. We have actually rather cheap ones. And even the poorest people in the world have one. So even though there are challenges and problems, it's hard to say that the mobile economy is not working rather well, especially if you put on your hat as an economist. Now, just to give one other add-on to this. Now, as an economist, I'm most concerned on how big the pie is and the quality of the pie. As an economist, I don't necessarily care about how it's distributed, unless, of course, that distribution affects the size or the quality of the pie. Now, in companies, everyone is worried about distribution. One company who gets less than another is unhappy. From an economist, I don't care whether one gets more or less, as long as the market is functioning and it's creating value, because the total value includes the money that's made from both sides. So when competition authorities and other people look into things, it's not to see that there's disputes or that one side makes more than the other, what we would call distributional issues. We need to look for systemic issues, and we don't see a lot of major systemic issues in the mobile space.
Thanks. We have a question a little bit on the future. It's how will the up-and-coming subscription-based business models affect the value distribution in the automotive ecosystem when it comes to licensing? Will we see newcomers with service downstream with strong patent portfolios to assert upstream?
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems that in IoT, the first thought that in IoT, if you ask what will be the same and what is different, is that you would think that a lot of these new vertical actors are not going to have SCPs. So in the mobile space, you have a lot of companies, most companies are also producing products or components, and they also have SEPs. Very few that only have just SEPs. Whereas when you converge both telecommunications into a new area like automotive, you have very few actors in automotive that would typically have SEPs in the standard compared to the convergent actors. So it could be more of a separation between who is actually doing, contributing to the technology of the standard versus those that are using the standard to implement it. Now, when it comes to the question of business models, I raised that a little bit. I think that multi-sided business models are interesting. You know, when a company gives away something for free to make money through advertising on another market, there's a shadow price that needs to be put back into the market where the service was given for free. So if you get value from having, say, Android on your mobile phone, even though Android was free, but Google makes a lot of money by having Android indirectly on your phone. In fact, they made so much money that they were fined $4 billion by the European Commission. So that value that's being created in the other market has to be seen as it's external to the market we're looking at, but has to be seen as part of the overall value that's being created in the original market. And if the level of licensing were to take place on that level, then of course you would have to take into account not only the direct value that's created, but also the indirect value to be able to get a fair assessment of total value. Does that answer the question, Claudia, do you think?
I think so.
Okay.
Having question says, if the SEP owners do as suggested and arrange licensing at an early stage, would patent exhaustion not prevent them from reaping the benefits of licensing later developed services using the same patents?
So this is a question about if you licensed upstream, would exhaustion stop?
I think it has to do with the timing.
Right.
Because if you license early, you still don't see the benefits and the value. I think that's what is meant with this question.
Yeah, so if you do what I discussed before, if you decide what is the value based on the end use case in relation to the consumer, that's where the value should be calculated. Then if you take that value and move it upstream, then you could still have a problem of exhaustion. And so instead of nowadays where you license downstream and have made right and create have made rights upstream, you would need to license, if you licensed upstream, you would have to have made rights going downstream. Maybe we wouldn't call them have made rights, we'd call them something else. But it would have to go in the other direction, because certainly not all the patents would be applicable to the upstream component. There would be much other patents. And so you would have to say, sure, we're going to license on this level at this value, but those later on are indemnified from further licenses. And of course, in a perfect world with no transactions, this kind of downstream or upstream model would be equal, but the world has transactions costs. And that's why I would probably argue more for a downstream model, or what oftentimes called access to all model.
Next question. What should be the role of the government regarding wireless standardized technology that allow for connected cars and smart cities?
Yeah, the role of the government. It's tricky now. Remember, I'm a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution, so I have to be careful now. The role of the government. I think the role of the government is always important. The question is, in which way? So certainly the government needs to try to support actors to be able to make market transactions. So managing the patent system, managing the contracting, handling things that are done in a way that doesn't violate competition policy, all these different issues that allow the institutional structure of the market and the market actors to interface with each other in a positive way. And they should, of course, support this process. Then it's possible when it comes to new areas that are strategic, the strategic infrastructure, such as smart cities and smart cars, that they could invest as a buyer. You know, one thing that people don't understand is that oftentimes the Silicon Valley wasn't just created by venture capitalists, it was created by the government very early on, buying a lot of military equipment developed by actors like Lockheed in the Silicon Valley area. So again, the government can play a very big role by being a buyer of connected vehicle infrastructure, smart city infrastructure. So in the way that that public funding is used to improve the infrastructure of cities and highways and mobility, this is a good way for the government to incentivize and pull as a strategic buyer. I think that would be a good, and is typically a normal way for the government to be involved, not from the other side dictating how market actors, but as an infrastructure buyer. That's how I would see the main participation.
Mm-hmm. Another question we have, how do you account for the fact that the technology is not always chosen by the market, but set in a standards process?
Yeah, so I think that we've come to the conclusion that a open consensus-based standardization process is pro-competitive in relation to everybody creating their own standard and fighting it out, having multiple actors fight out on de facto standards on the market. And that's still a question that could be debated and modeled and analyzed, but it tends to be among economists and market actors that there's this belief that a consensus-based process will get to a conclusion faster, cheaper, and better than having multiple actors fight out and having multiple standards and the uncertainty of, should my phone have this standard in it or that standard in it? I mean, we've had this in the mobile phone where we had multiple standards from the beginning. And I would say that most people would agree that one global standard has created a lot of direct and indirect value. And then we have to believe that the consensus process works, that this idea that people can come together and not by majority, but by consensus, be able to produce a system that has the best technology as possible. And for the most part, the different generations of mobile standards have obviously increased a lot in performance, but it's hard to know counterfactually whether this could be done better. And I'm not an expert on the workings of the SDOs themselves, on how they could find a way to incorporate and include a process that would increase the value of these standards by incorporating better technology. I'm not an expert to answer that.
Okay. There's another question saying that there is typically a commitment to license SCPs on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms and conditions. And some have argued that this non-discriminatory prong means to charge the same price for the same SCP, meaning the same price for a smartphone than for a car, for a smart meter. What do you think about this? What would be the impact for the sectors and also for consumers, if or also innovators, if ICP will have the same value independently on where it is implemented and the value it has?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number. Anytime this type of proposal is made, the first thing that comes to mind is that some people would be happy and some people would be unhappy. But in general, looking at it from economic theory, differential pricing can be efficient, especially across different markets. It doesn't seem to make sense that if you had connectivity in say a refrigerator, that in that use case produced a certain amount of value, and therefore the licensing would have a certain rate, that low rate should then now bleed over into another market where connectivity is producing a lot of value, because that would just be a race to the bottom. And of course, companies are smart. So if you're a SCP holder and you realize that if you give a low price based on the use value for the refrigerator, if you realize that if you do that, then everybody else is going to get that low price, then you won't do it. And so of course, then you'll use the high price for everybody, and then it'll become difficult for use cases where the value is less than other cases to be able to get efficient pricing. To me, it seems that most courts and economists have agreed, and the European Commission as well, is that even within the same market, that discrimination relates to similarly situated actors. I think that's the specific quote from the European Commission. So if we can have different prices for different actors in the same market, as long as they're not similarly situated, then why wouldn't we be able to differentiate across completely different verticals and applications? That would seem to open up for a much more efficient and use of connectivity and definitely spread connectivity much faster.
Thanks, Bo. We passed 1 minute to 5. I think this has been extremely interesting. We still have a couple of questions that unfortunately will not have time to answer, but maybe you can find some of the answers in the website, in the interview that is already published. As mentioned before, the presentation will be made available on for IP Council website after this webinar, and also please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter to receive updates on relevant academic studies, future webinars, and case law summaries. And thank you both. Thank you so much for giving this webinar, and thanks to all for attending.
Thanks, Claudia. Bye. Take care. Stay safe, everybody.
Bye.